This is Mr. Eugene, and today we're talking about something that operates invisibly underneath almost every relationship. Something so quiet most men never notice it happening until they're years deep into a life they didn't actually choose. I want you to think about this question for a moment. In your relationship, whose world are you living in? Are you living inside a life you built and she joined? Or are you living inside a life she built and you joined? That question sounds simple. It isn't. Because most men cannot answer it honestly without sitting with it for a while. And the men who finally do sit with it often discover something uncomfortable. They've been living inside someone else's world for so long they forgot they ever had one of their own. Let me tell you about a man I spoke with not long ago. I'll change a few details, but the situation is one I've heard versions of more times than I can count, which tells you something important right from the start. This isn't one man's unusual problem. This is a pattern affecting an enormous number of men who have no idea they're caught inside it. This man was in his early 30s, living a quiet, stable life in one state, working a decent job, building something modest but his own. For several years, he'd been in a long-distance relationship with a woman several years older, living several states away. They'd broken up and gotten back together more than once over those years. He called me because he was in crisis. She had essentially issued an ultimatum. She was approaching the end of her window to have children, and she wanted him to move to her state, give up his life there, and start a family with her on her timeline. Not eventually. Now. Within the year. He told me he loved her, didn't want to lose her. This was only the second serious relationship of his life, and the thought of losing it terrified him. By the time he called me, he wasn't asking whether he should do this. He was already mentally moving. The only thing he was negotiating for was whether he could have an hour or two to himself each day once he got there, since he had no friends or family in her state and would otherwise be spending every spare moment with her social circle. I let him talk for about 10 minutes, and then I stopped him. Because what struck me wasn't the ultimatum itself. Ultimatums happen. What struck me was how completely this man had disappeared inside someone else's life without realizing it. He was negotiating for scraps of his own existence, an hour here, an hour there, as though that was a reasonable outcome to hope for. He had no awareness that he was doing this. He genuinely believed he was lucky to be fighting for that hour. And underneath all of it was a belief he never questioned, that this was his only option. Move to her state and build her life, or lose her entirely. Nothing in between, no other path. That belief wasn't true, but it felt completely true to him, because he'd stopped being able to see anything beyond the narrow set of options she had placed in front of him. This is what happens when a man has quietly handed over the direction of his own life without ever making a conscious decision to do so. I asked him to do something that probably sounds strange at first, but it cuts directly to the heart of the issue. I asked him to imagine, just for a moment, that he had no idea what she wanted, to completely erase her preferences from his mind and ask himself a much simpler question. What do you actually want? He didn't have an answer. Not right away. In fact, I've had this exact conversation with many men over the years, and most of them respond the same way. A long pause, a kind of stunned expression, as though the question itself had never occurred to them as something they were allowed to ask. That reaction tells you everything. These are men who have spent so long organizing their lives around what a woman wants that the idea of asking what they themselves want feels almost foreign. Not forbidden exactly, just unfamiliar. Like a language they used to speak but haven't used in years. And here's the truth. You do have a choice. You've always had a choice. It just hasn't felt that way. Because somewhere along the line you learned, consciously or not, that access to her affection depended entirely on giving her what she wanted. That belief becomes so deeply embedded that having your own competing desires starts to feel dangerous, like it threatens the entire relationship. Before anyone accuses me of being unfair to the woman in that situation, let's look honestly at what she was actually doing. She was demanding, under threat of ending the relationship, that this man abandon his entire life, his city, his job, his independence, and rebuild it around hers. She had her house, her job, her family nearby, her friends. She wanted children on her exact timeline. And the implicit arrangement was that he would be the one working to fund this new shared life while she remained anchored in everything that already belonged to her. She knew he had real, reasonable concerns about this, knew he had no genuine desire to live in her state. And she made the demand anyway, not necessarily out of malice. Many women in this position don't see what they're doing as selfish or unusual at all. They're simply pursuing what they want, the way they've been taught and reinforced to do for most of their lives. That's the part worth sitting with. Imagine for a moment Having that level of clarity and that level of permission to simply state what you want and expect the people around you to rearrange their lives accordingly. Most men have never been given that kind of internal permission, and learning to grant it to yourself is where everything starts to change. So how does a man actually respond to this once he recognizes it in his own life? It starts with seriously asking yourself how you actually want to live, not in vague terms, in specific, concrete terms. Is there a woman somewhere in the vision you have for your life? If so, what role does she play in it? Are there children in that vision? If so, how do you want to raise them, and what do you want to pass on to them? What does your actual day-to-day life look like when you imagine it clearly, without anyone else's preferences shaping the picture? Once a man has genuinely answered these questions for himself, once he's built something of his own and has a clear sense of the life he's constructing, he's in a completely different position. He's no longer asking to be allowed into someone else's world on whatever terms she sets. He's offering his own world and seeing whether she wants to be part of it. And this isn't simply flipping the dynamic in reverse. There's an important distinction here. When a man builds a genuine life and invites a woman into it, the implicit offer is usually one of provision, protection, and a better lifestyle than she could easily build entirely on her own. That's typically what differentiates a man's invitation from a woman's demand. A woman's version of this dynamic often sounds like, "Come into my world and take care of me." A man's version, when he's actually leading, sounds like, "Come into my world and I will take care of you." The difference matters enormously, even though on the surface they might look similar. Let me go back to that man on the phone, because what happened next is the part that actually matters most. I asked him directly. Forget for a moment that she wants children soon. Forget the timeline she's placed on you. If you had no idea any of that was happening, if none of her preferences existed in your mind right now, would starting a family in the next year be something you would want for your own life? Would you be thinking about any of this on your own? There was a long silence. And then something shifted in how he was speaking. Because in that moment, he realized that none of this had ever actually been his idea. Moving to her state wasn't his idea. Becoming a father within the next year wasn't his idea. Restructuring his entire social life around her friends and family wasn't his idea. These ideas had been placed in his mind by her, repeated so consistently over time that he had genuinely forgotten they weren't originally his own. He had absorbed her timeline as though it were his timeline, her urgency as though it were his urgency. And because he didn't have a strong, clearly defined vision of his own life to compare it against, it had been easy for him to drift further and further into her version of what his life should look like. But in that moment of genuine reflection, his own answer came back to him immediately. Without hesitation, he said he wanted to get his own life in order first. Build something of his own, develop his career further, strengthen his social circle. Take time to genuinely explore relationships rather than locking into one woman's ultimatum out of fear. That was his answer. Clear, immediate, no maybe attached to it. And that distinction matters enormously. If you ever catch yourself thinking, well, maybe I could do that, pause right there. That hesitation, that maybe, is usually a signal that the desire isn't actually yours. It was placed there by someone else, and you're trying it on to see if it fits. Compare that to how a woman in this kind of situation typically operates. She isn't thinking, maybe I want him to move here and take care of me. There's no maybe in her mind. She's clear, decisive, certain enough about what she wants that she's willing to state it directly and expect the relationship to bend around it. That's the lesson worth taking from this. Learn to recognize the difference between what you genuinely want and what has simply been suggested to you so often that it started to feel like your own idea. Men thrive when they're operating from a clear sense of their own direction. So the real work isn't about managing her demands more skillfully or negotiating slightly better terms within someone else's structure. It's about stepping back and doing the work of figuring out what you actually want, completely independent of what anyone else wants from you. What's your mission? What kind of life are you building? Where do you want to live and why? What does financial stability look like for you specifically? What does your health and your body need from you? Who are the people you want in your life? And what role do you want a relationship to play inside all of that, rather than letting a relationship become the entire structure your life gets built around? Get those pieces in order first. Build the actual life. Not a fantasy, not a vague someday, an actual functioning version of the life you want to be living. And then, when you meet a woman worth building something with, you're no longer asking permission to exist inside her world on whatever terms she happens to offer. You're simply showing her what you've already built. This is who I am. This is the life I'm living. This is what I can offer you if you want to be part of it. If she likes what she sees, she's welcome to join you. If she doesn't, that tells you something valuable too, and it costs you considerably less than discovering it 5 years and one lost identity later. Most men never ask themselves the question we started with today. Whose life am I actually living right now? Many of you watching this have never asked yourselves that question either. Not because you're weak or foolish, because somewhere along the way the question simply stopped occurring to you as something you are allowed to ask. You are allowed to ask it. You're allowed to answer it honestly, and you're allowed to start building toward that answer starting today, regardless of how many years you've already spent living inside someone else's version of your own life. Men, when you really sit with that question, whose world are you actually living in right now? What's the honest answer? Subscribe for the conversations that help good men find their way back to a life that's actually their own.